Good morning, everyone. I want people to know what influences me and has shaped the woman that I currently am today. For throughout history, we have seen how when a woman dares to speak her truth and to push back against the violence she experiences, she is often villainized, she is turned into an outcast, and at the very least, no one even dares to care. What does it mean to be a young black woman living in post-apartheid South Africa? Well, I reflect on two women's life experiences who have both gone through some form of systemic gender-based violence, which has been influenced by their socioeconomic class position, their abilities, and of course, race and gender. Political stalwart and anti-apartheid activist Mama Winnie Mandela was born in 1936 and lived most of her life fighting against the apartheid system. She spent most of her life fighting for not only the liberation for women, but that of the broader black South African population. This system was a system that characterized the livelihoods of black families, black communities, to violence, and subjected them to violence, and only really to further the colonialists' selfish endeavors. Because of Mama Winnie's politics and how she rose against the system of violence, she was labeled an instigator and a wayward charlatan by the men of the liberation movement. The term wayward now means somebody who is headstrong and is difficult to control, and indeed, Umama possessed these traits. Mama Winnie fought alongside within the liberation movement, resorted to casting her an outcast because, in their view, she was becoming too difficult to control. You see, Mama Winnie's politics was making her act out of place in the man's club. This is a woman who has literally bled in defiance against a system that deemed black people's lives worthless and powerless. This is a woman who even questioned the liberation movement's objectives and how we were addressing the issue of socio-economic emancipation in a society that was growing fundamentally capitalist. Umama Winnie was a beacon of hope to many black communities and a key figure who kept the fire burning in our quest for freedom. The next story is the story of the woman who raised me and played a vital role in the becoming of my adult years. Nomajoni Yolanda Dyantyi, who is my grandmother, but I won't speak much about that. And she was born in the year 1956 and spent most of her life raising me and fending for her family. I want to reflect at a specific point in her life in the 1970s. Just shortly after the birth of her daughter, who is my birth mother, she was arrested in Berea, Johannesburg, which back then was a predominantly white community. Now you see, back in the apartheid era, black people had to carry with them passbooks, which allowed them to be in white communities for work purposes alone. One fateful evening, Umama went to the stores and she returned back home, and she didn't take her passbook with her. And on one fateful evening, she came across two white male officers who stopped her, who asked her for her passbook, which was also called a dompas back then. And they proceeded to harass her, they arrested her, and they held her custody overnight at the Hillbrow police station with her baby on her back for simply not carrying her passbook. The next reflection, or the next story, of course, is my story. I was born in 1997, and I was raised by my grandmother, Nomajoni Dyantyi, in Randburg, which is also another predominantly white suburban community, where she proceeded to work as a domestic worker for nearly 38 years of her life, fending for me, fending for herself, and for extended family members. I completed my matric year, and I enrolled as a first-year university student in 2015 at Rhodes University. And in the first 4 months of me being a student at Rhodes University, I then became a victim, or I fell victim to sexual violence, or to be more specific, rape. I was dragged on a night out by two young adult men. They dragged me. I was violated and humiliated by these men. And what was even further difficult is the fact that I still had to continue my journey and navigate my journey as a student at Rhodes And for those who've been to the Rhodes University campus, can attest to how small that campus is. So it was virtually impossible to escape this reality where I had to bump into these men almost every day of my life. I suffered unimaginable trauma from this ordeal, and I still do today. But the reason why I'm sharing this story is in hopes that other young African women who have faced and gone through similar challenges like mine can know that there is no shame in speaking out against speaking up rather about the various ordeals that we've survived at the hands of toxic masculinity and patriarchal violence. I carried this burden of being raped with me throughout my academic career whilst trying to make sense of why this happened to me. It almost felt like a sense of shame that I was carrying, and I was blaming myself, and I had this guilt that perhaps there was something I could have done better in ensuring my safety, and maybe I could have avoided being violated in the manner that I was. On the 17th of April, 2016, in my second year as a student, a list of 11 names of former and current male students at Rhodes University circulated on social media under the tag #RUReferenceList. This list did not allude to anything, nor did it even state that these men were perpetrators of any form of violence. What it did do instead is that it unmasked the very nature of what we believed, what we experienced and referred to as a perpetual rape culture crisis on the campus. And it broke the silence that we were subjected to as the survivors of gender-based violence. For the first time ever, I found myself being able to speak out and to own my story and my truth. That #RUReferenceList social media post sparked a movement that erupted across the university campus for the weeks that followed. You see, what happened was that the women and also members of the LGBTQI community at Rhodes stood together in solidarity, and we rose against the system, and we fought back against the system of institutionalized patriarchal violence. And really, this violence put us in a position where we were exposed to further re-victimization. Those 11 names, or those 11 men rather, were men who were already known within our community as students who had been accused of being perpetrators of gender-based violence. But they weren't the only ones, and it wasn't just the 11 men that we were protesting against. We were standing up in defiance against a whole system of patriarchal dominance and its lack of care and regard for the livelihood for the women on the campus, as well as the allies as well. I was heavily involved in this movement to a point where I was identified by the university's management as being a leader of the protest action. I don't think I was a leader. I think and I believe that I was just a survivor who was fighting in her personal capacity for some form of justice and for my story to be heard. In 2017, in my third year, the university then leveled various charges against me, and a disciplinary hearing was instituted to punish me for my alleged involvement in the protest action. In November 2017, in the middle of my final year exams, where I would have graduated and been the first person in my family to attain a university degree, I was given a lifetime exclusion from Rhodes University and further labeled an instigator who led what the university calls a vigilante movement. All of this because we just simply said no and were pushing back against the violence. And it's interesting to mention that in contrast to what I've gone through, what had happened is that those men and the men, even after my stay at the institution, have proceeded to graduate and become people who are now employed in the system. My chances at ever returning at higher education have been made small, and my dreams as a black woman have been deterred because I am a woman who dared to challenge the status quo. It's because of the norms, the beliefs, and the various institutions that have a strong hold in our society. Patriarchy has influenced, the stronghold in our society, that women's experiences have been deemed unimportant and virtually impossible to believe, because patriarchy decides for us on the justice we deserve for being raped, for being murdered, abused, and even economically excluded. All these experiences are not personal, they are very much political, and they shape what Black African women continue to experience as systemic violence. To be a black woman living in South Africa means you are at risk at experiencing violence that is racialized, that is sexist, and all because it's become so engraved within our ways of being. There's a huge desensitization that exists to the lived experiences that we go through and the daily violations of our constitutional rights. I am fighting back, and hopefully my story can set a precedent for other young African women's experiences to be heard and given justice. Having been influenced by all that is around me and the history that I've encountered, I've come to learn the value in speaking out and speaking up about my journey, and how rather we should, as women, use our experiences as instruments of change in our society. We need to join the women that have come before us, who have influenced our contribution to society and our lives as we know it, in the legacy of resistance to fight and push back against systemic patriarchal violence in all of the spaces we occupy. As painful as it is, reflecting on my journey as a former student at Rhodes, and even on the lives of the two women, Winnie Mandela, who was the first black woman social worker turned political activist and leader, who had her legacy towards her last years of her life tarnished because black men, and just men in general, could not allow a woman to bask in the power that she is. And Yolanda Dyantyi, who arrived in Johannesburg as a rural young woman turned domestic worker to fend not only for her family, but for myself at the mercy of white people, is to show you that the personal lived experience cannot be separated from the political and one's citizenship, and that it is important for us to understand the dynamics of our society that contribute and expose black women, African women, to the various violations we go through. Now, I cannot be afraid, I cannot be afraid to speak my truth and to own it, nor can I be afraid to hold the system accountable and to demand for better. I believe that by owning our stories, archiving them in whatever ways possible, and passing down this knowledge pertaining to better understanding what shapes our experiences as African women is very integral to shaping the just, equitable, and violent-free society that we envision and desire and deserve. I would like other young women to join me as we share our experiences and ideas with the world, because they do matter. Our stories, beyond the statistics, beyond the data, are powerful political tools and instruments of change that should be used towards fostering the socio-economic change and the political change that we want, not only for ourselves, but for future young generations of women and girls to follow. Thank you.